Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Talk Globally, an initiative by Sir Eta Alpha, the Honor Society for International Relations here at Webster Vienna Private University, where we talk about global politics and all the challenges that humanity faces. Today we have a very special guest here with us. He is a political scientist and an author. He is also the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, which he co-founded in 2007. In 2005, he wrote Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. In 2008, he wrote What Does China Think? And in 2021, he wrote The Age of Unpeace, which will be the focus of this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Leonard. Mark, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. This is a very exciting episode for me, as I've read your book and I've cited it many times in my papers. So
Great.
I have my own copy here with my bookmarks, and so
Fantastic.
I'm very excited about it.
It looks like it's been well read.
Yes, indeed. So I guess to start, for those who are unfamiliar with your work, what exactly is the Age of Unpeace? How did you coin the term, and what utility does it have in the current conflicts, and what do you have to say about that one?
Okay, so the starting point is that traditionally people have thought about global politics as being about war and peace, that you have these kind of periods of war, and then between these periods of war you have long periods where there is no war, and where economics kind of blooms and people get on with each other, but it's punctuated by the wars. And under that kind of traditional definition, you would have thought, certainly before 2022, that we lived in a time of peace, an incredible time of peace for many people around the world, because the old ways that the war worked, traditionally wars were declared between different countries, they were fought by soldiers, and they had a start and an end. And actually, it's many years since you had a war that started like that. So there is a lot of violence in the world, but typically it's not just fought by armies who wear uniforms. A lot of the combatants and the victims are civilians. Wars rarely start with a declaration of war, and people haven't really got a kind of idea of conceptualizing the state of international relations. But also, the other thing which people assumed was that through globalization and connectivity, people get bound together to create, so much so that it would create harmony and people wouldn't conflict with each other. And that was the hope in the 1990s, that we were at the end of history, and that we would have this sort of flat world that was... And my kind of argument in the book is that many of the things which were meant to be bringing us together are in fact driving us apart, and often being turned into instruments of power and sometimes even weapons. And the Age of Unpeace is about how, even in a world where countries haven't formally declared war on each other, there's a lot of violence, and there are lots of attempts to try and turn all of the different links that bind countries together into weapons, and that actually more people are killed and threatened and maimed and hurt by those sort of non-traditional types of violence than they are in the world, even by the big wars like the war in Ukraine, the war in Sudan, the war in Gaza.
Right. Thank you. That's a very interesting concept. And the next question is about the impact of this terminology on international law. Because, like you mentioned, the dichotomy of war versus peace is more or less the framework that sustains the laws of war, meaning upon the declaration of a war, certain rules apply that in terms of peace, they don't. So without this clear distinction in the Age of Unpeace, what implications do you think that would have on international law? When do the rules of war apply? Or what would that even look like?
I think that's one of the big worries I think one of the troubling things about today is that even when countries are formally at war with each other, they're not necessarily obeying the law, and we're seeing lots of accusations of war crimes against Russia, against Israel in different parts of the world. But more importantly than that, when things are not formal wars, they go beneath the radar, and there isn't a legal framework that governs them. And that, I mean, the sort of central metaphor I use in the book is the idea that international relations is like a kind of marriage that's going wrong, between a couple that can't stand each other's company, but they can't get divorced. And in a marriage, what happens is the stuff that brings the couple together during the good times is often the way that they hurt each other in the bad times. So in a marriage, it's about who gets custody of the pet dog, who gets the holiday home, and above all, the children, and they're used and manipulated by the parents to hurt one another. But in geopolitics, it's in fact all the different things that bound us together during the good times. So it's trade, technology, migration, the internet, climate change, COVID. These are all things which have been turned into tools of power which people are using to hurt each other. And often there aren't legal frameworks which govern that, because we thought about these things not as acts of power politics, but more through other kind of channels, whether it's about trade or about public health or things like that. And that legal grey area means that a lot of damage can be done without people really either recognising it or having ways to protect people.
And now the next part of the book, actually, I will read a part of the book. It's in chapter 2. You write, in the pre-modern age, God was seen as the ultimate source of authority. With secularism, it was the state. With liberalism, it was the individual. But in the future, the algorithm will be sovereign. So a fundamental principle of statehood, or modern statehood as we understand it, is territory. And yet the algorithm, as an inherently intangible and far-reaching entity, being sovereign would perhaps require a new definition of sovereignty. So what would that mean in terms of territorial cyberspace borders, for example, like the Treaty of Westphalia, or what impact would the algorithm as the new sovereign have on the concept of modern statehood?
Well, I think one of the crises of modern statehood is that we live in this hyper-connected world where there's almost nothing in our lives that is just national. So you've got the interpenetration of countries, but in a way that was sort of almost unthinkable in the past. You know, if you go back to the Cold War, there was very little contact between the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and the West. You know, the Europeans might have bought a bit of oil and gas from the Soviet Union. There were a few people who went across borders, but there was very, very little direct contact. You didn't have information flowing between the different parts of the world. You literally had walls in the Berlin Wall which stopped people from travelling. And now, you know, every day people, you know, there are just billions of bits of information, of data flowing back and forth across the world, products which, like, you know, iPhones which have got ridiculously complicated supply chains where stuff is made in over 60 countries in the world, which goes back and forth across borders. And, you know, so whether it's, you know, the food that we eat, the culture that we enjoy, the information that we get, the clothes we wear, almost all of these things are products of like enormous amounts of interdependence. And that makes kind of traditional ideas of sovereignty very, very difficult to defend, because so much of what happens in your country is a product of what's happening in other places, and you can't really control, except in a very, at the margins, you know, what's coming in and out of your country. And with information, it's even more difficult. And we've seen, you know, in the book, I talk about how in the last decade, you know, there have been over 40 elections which have been interfered with by people in other countries, and there's lots of extraordinary stories. One very powerful example for me was when George Floyd was killed in America. Lots of people were outraged, and there were real outpourings of solidarity around the world and within the US, and a lot on social media about what was going on. And, you know, a lot of it was genuine and authentic, but it turns out also there were troll farms in Africa that were being funded by the Russian intelligence services that were pushing out a lot of information which was designed to exacerbate the very real racial tensions which were taking place in the US. So you've got this very complicated, entangled world where all sorts of things are going on, and where people are sometimes deliberately manipulating your own affairs, and where it's quite difficult for governments to control what happens within their borders. And actually, if you try to do that, the cost is so high. I mean, nobody wants to live in North Korea or a country which has real kind of control over its territory.
Right, and that's actually linked to the next question, which was globalization as a weapon, which in part three you write about an anatomy of unpeace, where you describe how globalization again was turned into a weapon and how connectivity causes conflict. Could you just elaborate a bit on that, which you already have touched upon, but could you just elaborate a bit?
So I think there are two parts. One is like how connectivity causes conflict, and the other is about how it's used as a kind of means for conflict. So I think on the cause front, that's something which has been a sort of shock to many people, because we assumed in the 90s that what globalization would do would be to bring people together to create a common sense of destiny, that you create a sort of material base which would bring the whole world together, and then they'd then be a kind of political superstructure on top of that, and then the internet could provide the kind of infrastructure for a global demos that was kind of discussing how we'd all work together. But in fact, what we found is that connectivity actually creates a lot of conflict in several ways. Firstly, what we know from social media is that once you start bringing large numbers of people together and you kind of integrate them, they often actually end up polarizing and finding and splitting into little tribes of people who are kind of similar to each other. We've got a lot of information about filter bubbles and the kind of fragmentation of our societies into these different groups. And that's definitely happening. And then the second thing that it does is it leads people to compare each other to other groups. So once you've chosen your tribe and your group, you then compare yourself to other groups. And what connectivity and digital technologies do is changes who you compare yourself to. So when I was growing up, not that long ago, we mainly compared ourselves to our neighbours or our parents or people who were like from a similar place to us. But in the sort of world that is connected by social media and the internet, everyone can compare themselves to the most privileged and best off people in the world. So this creates a huge amount of envy and of a sense of grievance for many people, because you look at Instagram and Facebook and things like that, and they're basically factories of insecurity, because you see how fantastic everyone else's life is, and your own existence can't possibly compete with these sometimes heavily curated versions of reality from other people. So you both have the kind of fragmentation, then you have the kind of sense of grievance and comparisons which come in, and then the third thing is a sense of a loss of control, some of which comes from these algorithms that are making so many decisions about our everyday lives. So whether you get into university or school or not, whether you get a job, whether what if you're dating, the sort of people that get served up to you on dating platforms, the kind of media, and so much of our lives is no longer within our control. And the leitmotif of politics in many different places is about taking back control. So what you have as a result of those things is quite a lot of tension growing, with people splitting into smaller and smaller tribes. They resent each other and they don't like each other, and they want to take back control for themselves. So that creates a lot of friction. So that's the cause. And then the other thing which you have is new opportunities for globalization to be weaponized. And the opportunities come from the fact that we're not, like in the Cold War, a long way from each other. We're in each other's faces all the time. We're like all countries are heavily connected with each other, and therefore they're able to think about, are there ways where we can turn this web of connections which binds us with other players into tools of power. So what you often see is countries are looking at ways of turning, so whether it's trading relationships. So Russia, for example, was the main supplier of oil and gas to many different countries around the world. So threatening to cut them off, you could literally turn the lights off in another country. So this relationship, which is meant to create interdependence, ends up becoming weaponized. The same was true with China and its supplies of PPE, protective equipment during COVID, where it was telling countries, and mass diplomacy and vaccine national, all of these things can be turned into kind of tools. You could also have cyber attacks. You can have election interference. Some countries have even, if you look at the way Russia's waging the war on Ukraine, it's deliberately driving people from their homes in the hope that they will go into other European countries, which then creates political pressure on the governments that are supporting Ukraine because of flows of migration. So all of these different things which bind us together can be turned into weapons in a way that was not possible when the world wasn't as densely connected as it is now.
Right. And in current times, concerns of privacy and individual freedom are at the forefront of many debates. And in chapter 1, you write about how surveillance state and surveillance capitalism end up working together to erode individual freedom. Could you explain the difference between surveillance capitalism in the US, as you write, versus a surveillance state like China?
So, yeah, I mean, what I was talking about is, one of the interesting things about these digital technologies and the fact that so much of our life is now digitized means that we are no longer unitary people. We are kind of collections of data, and we leave these trails wherever we go, and this data can be a very valuable tool, both to make money for companies that are desperate for our attention. So they mine it and they sell it and they package it and they use it to make a profit, to get us addicted to different types of content, to get us to buy different products. And there's been a lot of very interesting books and academic research into the idea of surveillance capitalism and how the new global economy is very, very different from the pre-digital economy. And Shoshana Zuboff wrote this great book conceptualizing the idea of surveillance capitalism. But it's quite interesting. So, and in the US, the digital revolution has been driven forward by a lot of these huge digital empires, whether it's GAFA, Google and Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple have created this completely new world. These are companies that didn't exist when I was born, and they now control a vast amount of the global economy. And in China, what you're seeing is that the state is finding that the very same data that is so useful to these American companies that are trying to monetize it, to turn it into profit, can also be a source of political control and social stability. And one of the big challenges that authoritarian governments have had throughout history is knowing what's going on in their country. One of the reasons why a lot of dictatorships end up coming a cropper is that they are not in touch with public opinion. There's a limit to how much you can control people. They often make mistakes and they kind of miscalculate things. But if a lot of the lives of individual citizens are being held online and are creating these trails of data, you can have much higher levels of knowledge about what's going on in your society, and you can use that knowledge and that data also to shape people's behavior. And you've seen in China how they have gone about both creating vast amounts of data about their citizens and then using new technologies of machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand where people are going and to kind of shape their behaviour. And that is leading to a very different kind of politics. And what's quite interesting as well, I think, is that, so we often think about the US and China as kind of polar opposites, but in the book I also talk about how increasingly the competition for digital supremacy between the US and China is leading both countries to borrow each other's technology, to copy each other, and to compete in order to outcompete each other. So you're seeing a sort of gradual process of convergence, which is going on.
In the last part of your book, you state that a more united planet brings with it many challenges of connectivity. So you propose a few steps to disarm connectivity, like establishing healthy boundaries and being realistic about what you want to control. I think you stated about 5 steps. What exactly do you mean by disarming connectivity, and where are we headed?
So my kind of starting point is, if you look at the Cold War, the biggest and the most dangerous thing that the world faced was the danger of a kind of nuclear Armageddon. So people realised that nuclear technology was something which could literally send the world over the precipice, and that in order to save humanity, you needed to get a grip on nuclear technology. So they started working out ways of using people's fear of nuclear Armageddon to create norms which would govern how nuclear technology was used, and then eventually to move into disarming, and you had all these kind of disarmament talks towards the end of the Cold War, and the détente between the Soviet Union and the USA. But in our age, the most dangerous things that are going on, I think, are about connectivity wars going wrong and layering on top of each other. And it's not that difficult to see after the last few years, when we've had a sort of global pandemic that turned us all prisoners into our homes. You're seeing the damage which climate change is producing. You're seeing cyber attacks which are having more and more kind of deadly consequences in different places. You can see how you could have extraordinary tragedies that come out of the weaponization of interdependence. So the question is, what can you do about it? And my fear is that it's a lot harder to do anything about that than nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are really difficult to make. They're very expensive. Only states could really afford to do them. They're a very small number of components which you can use in them, uranium, plutonium, which you can kind of track and you can spot. But if everything can be turned into a weapon, it's much harder to work out how to stop it. And if there's no real distinction between what's a weapon and what's a kind of technology that improves your social life or allows companies to make money, it's much harder to do as well. So the question is, what can we do about it? And I kind of don't think that you can actually regulate it in the way that you regulated nuclear weapons, because if you get rid of connectivity, we know we don't want to become North Korea. We don't want to go back to the Dark Ages. So the question is, can you have a sort of form of therapy? So I use this idea of self-help and therapy as a kind of way of thinking about the political challenges at the moment, of trying to turn these toxic interactions into ones which are less toxic. And so that is I don't think you can solve the problem. The question is whether you can manage it so that you can keep the good bits of connectivity, but you can try and take the things which are very dangerous and toxic and make them less dangerous. And that has various components. First is being kind of aware of the problem. If you're not aware of it, you can't do anything about it. And I think often in previous decades, elites were not aware of the dark side of a lot of the advantages of connectivity. So, for example, global trade is amazing. It drives prices down. It allows you to have technologies which are amazing, which are much better than what you had before. But there were a lot of people who worked in particular sectors, whether it's kind of steel workers or auto workers in the Rust States in America, or coal miners in the north of England, or people like that, who were victims of kind of deindustrialization, and their communities changed. And anyway, a lot of them felt resentful and then ended up turning against the whole idea of globalization and of connectivity, and voting for Donald Trump and wanting to build walls to shut their countries off from other players. So part of it is about being aware of it, because actually there are things you can do to help the people who are losing out and to make it less kind of risky. The second thing, as you said, is like establishing clear, safer boundaries, because if people think everything's out of control, they're going to want to build walls. So I say that the difference shouldn't be between kind of open and closed societies, but between managed and unmanaged interdependence. So if you have a sense about what's going on and what the advantages are, then you can try and look at who's losing out from these connections and see whether you can make them feel safe again. So, it could be, if it's about economic interdependence, that you help to invest in parts of the country where jobs are leaving, you retrain people. It could be that you make it safer by introducing better domestic legislation. So if people are very worried about migration and people coming into neighbourhoods and driving wages down, that having a minimum wage, having decent social policies, there are lots of things that you can do to make sure that you have a kind of managed process. But the other thing is about being sort of you said about being realistic about what you could control, because the big fear at the moment is that many people think that we're moving into a kind of new Cold War where they don't they think that we have battles of different systems, and they kind of see almost every point of contact that we have with other countries and cultures as being weaponized. So part of what you need to do, I think, is rather than thinking that you can turn everyone into clones of yourselves and spread the way that you are, to work out how we can live together and how we can carry on living the life we want to live alongside people who want to live in different ways. But that is something which is quite a challenge. So they're all things which are quite difficult to do, but I think they lead to a different sort of agenda to the agenda that we had in global politics in the 1990s and the early years of this century.
And my final question is for students who are interested in the topics that you so eloquently write and speak about. What areas of research do you suggest they go into? What are the gaps in the literature that you think they should invest into? What direction should they go?
So I think one of the most interesting things about the moment that we're in now is that we have a huge number of interconnected problems which are being experienced right across the world, but in slightly different ways. And I think one of the big weaknesses of a lot of the literature of international relations is that it comes from a very specific cultural and economic and historical kind of perspective. Most of it, is Anglo-Saxon, comes from the US, from the UK. And what people have done is they've taken their kind of experiences and universalized them. I think what's very exciting about the current moment is that there are attempts to rethink international relations from lots of different perspectives. So I spend a lot of time in China, and there are lots of attempts to think about what does a Chinese school of international relations look like, what kind of concepts will be in the heart of that, and they think about different building blocks to international relations, different norms, ways of merging the kind of 21st century experience of globalization with the experience of socialism since 1949, but also incorporating, Confucianism, ancient Chinese thinking. Anyway, and you've got similar processes that are going on in India, in Iran. I spent a lot of time in the past talking to Iranian IR scholars who were kind of trying to look at their kind of Persian history, but also to think about what elements they can bring into their theorizing of international relations from Islam and from the kind of religious texts which are very central to Iranian political life. And I think there are a lot of countries, in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, that are sort of reconceptualizing how sovereignty is organised in their own spaces and taking back more control of how their national politics works, but also have kind of interesting ideas which they're bringing into the study of international relations. So I think one thing which would be very exciting is having a more plural perspective and trying to gather some of these different perspectives from different places around the world and seeing how they relate to each other and looking at things in a much more comparative context. I think the second thing is about the kind of expansion of international relations into lots of different areas of life. So I think the intersection between sort of geopolitics and international relations and technology and climate politics and migration, I think there are lots of areas which we used to think of more as domestic areas, but which are now becoming very internationalized, and where a lot of the people who look at those areas don't necessarily understand how much power and geopolitics is actually driving what's going on in those different areas. So I think that's also very, very interesting to kind of look at those things. And then maybe the third thing is to think about it more in sort of organizational terms. So in my book, I spend quite a lot of time looking at network theory and sort of trying to understand how, if you have a sort of if you look at what you can get from network theory from natural sciences, it's a very different way of thinking about how power is organized and how relationships work to the more sort of classical models that we get from international relations. So I think those are three different ways of coming at these big global questions, but where there is a lot to be done, which builds on and complements the sort of classical textbooks which you get given about international relations.
Mark, thank you so much for stopping by and giving us so much food for thought. We look forward to having you back soon, someday.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of another episode of Talk Globally, the initiative by Sir Eta Alpha, the Honor Society for International Relations here at Webster Vienna Private University. Make sure you comment, subscribe, share it with a friend, and be on the lookout for many new episodes coming very soon. Thank you.